welcome to the January 2025 edition of TrustMasters Monthly. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today, I think for the first time in the history of TrustMasters Monthly, we have returning guests and our experts, Shay Brown and Kim Lucy. Shay, Kim, thank you so much for coming back. We really, really appreciate you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Now, one of the things that, well, first, let me start with some housekeeping. Just as with every other TrustMaster session, we do have access to Q&A. As you're entering your question, please know that we'll moderate those, but might not necessarily have time to address your questions during the session. We do hope to leave a little bit of time at the end of today's session to be more explicit in coverage of the questions that you have. That said, we left off last month's session with a number of unanswered questions that we really hope to kick off today's session in addressing. So first and foremost, one of the questions that we had from a viewer was, how should companies think about the delays of harmonized standards? So primarily in the EU from CINCINNALEC for the EU AI Act. And is ISO 42001 a good base for those who want to start preparing themselves now? And that said, I think there's maybe a pre-question that needs to be answered. And that is, Shay, Kim, maybe help our viewers understand just a little bit about what a harmonized standard is so that we can then address the question more fully.
Yeah, I can jump in and answer that. I have a little bit of experience. So essentially a harmonized standard is a standard that is developed in the EU by a European standards body such as CINCINNALEC, ETSI, at the request of the European Commission in order to conform with the essential requirements of a European regulation. So like the EU AI Act, it comes as a result of a request from the European Commission to create these standards, and an organization can use such a standard to prove conformity with that, that regulation.
Thank you, Kim. And then that said, as you think about what appears to be a pretty significant delay in the production of the harmonized standards around the AI Act, for our viewers that feel compelled to take some action, is ISO 42001 and building an AIMS, whether it's certified or not, but building an AIMS an appropriate next step?
Yeah, and I'll start here too, and Shay can jump in if he'd like to add anything. I think the answer is yes, in the sense that as someone who was part of the committee that helped to write 42001, we definitely took the AI Act into account as we're creating the standard. It is mapped fairly closely to the regulation at a high level, of course, because 42001 is an international standard. It is not granularly, specific to any one regulation, but at a high level, it is closely aligned with the AI Act. And what 42001 does, because it's a management system, if you go back to one of the core principles and very first clauses, is it asks an organization to consider their context, determine their stakeholders. And as you are an organization thinking about building out your management system and thinking about what responsible AI means to your organization, if you're an organization to whom the AI Act is applicable, that is a key element that you need to consider as part of the context of your organization. That's not something that you can just ignore as you're building out your management system. And so if you are subject to the AI Act, you need to consider that as a regulation that your organization is subject to and build that into your system level controls as you're designing system lifecycle controls that are in annexes A and B of 42001. You need to tailor those to be specific to the AI Act, because that's a relevant contextual concern for your organization. And any good auditor who's coming to audit your organization would look at your context and say, hey, you do international business, you're subject to the AI Act. It should be part of the context of your organization and your controls. So, it's not something that you should just approach as this easy checklist, but something that you can use to build the foundation of your organization and say, all right, I'm subject to the AI Act. I also operate in the US, and I should consider the NIST AI RMF and incorporate elements of that into my management system. And so it's very flexible and scalable to all of these things if you implement it in the correct way. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, and Kim, that's beautiful in that everything, and I think you've mentioned this before in conversation, but with our management systems, everything is applicable only in context of the organization. So as we think about risk, it has to be in context. As we think about impacts, those have to be in context. As we think about controls to bring to bear to actually ensure that we're doing things responsibly, those two have to be in context with our external stakeholders and external regulation. It feels like a very, very straightforward thing, but it also feels like it could be very overwhelming for some organizations.
Yeah, and that's why I also say that additionally building your scope statement as you're doing a management system is also really critical, because it's considering what technical elements are in scope for your management system, but it's also considering all of those, external contextual elements, your stakeholders, all of those things need to be considered as you're thinking about your scope.
Yes. And just an aside very quickly, we're talking about ISO 42001, but for those interested, there's another ISO standard, ISO 5339, that does a really, really solid job of helping organizations better understand stakeholders, both internal and external, and can be really supportive in helping you separate those stakeholders that are making versus those stakeholders that are using the systems as you are building out your context. So for those interested, check out ISO 5339. It will be worth your while. I feel like I've been cutting you out of the conversation to this point. I don't know if you have an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think because, I mean, we face it every day because we have to help clients prepare for both the EU AI Act and potentially ISO 42001 if they choose that. And they're waiting for the harmonized standards. And that's a source of uncertainty. And so, I mean, the way I like to think about it is, what is the other alternative? You know that the schedule was that it was supposed to come out in April. We don't know if that's going to happen. And so what's the risk? Like, I could wait as an organization, I could wait to see what those final regulations are, what those final standards are, and then quickly try to implement them afterwards. The deadline for most high-risk systems is going to be August 2026. That's kind of risky. And the other is I can look at the law itself and try to implement what I think is what the law says, right? A lot of people are also trying to do that. But then if you look at what CENTELAC has published so far in terms of their way they're thinking, and I think we all know people who are in these committees, you can try to anticipate what are these standards likely to look like and how much would they deviate from things that you might have access to, like current ISO standards like 42001 and others. And I think what you would find is that the difference between what you would naturally do trying to follow something like 42001 plus some other like 42005 for impact assessments and things like this, and bias, the standards around bias, all of those are going to look very similar to what the harmonized standards. There might be some slight changes, but they're not going to be significantly different in kind, and probably not substantively different. You might call things slightly different. You might have to do maybe something tiny different. And so in my mind, it makes total sense to, instead of just trying to go your own way and just comply with the act, just your best guess, and instead of waiting until the standards come out, it makes sense to go the route where you think you're going to get 90% or 85% of the way there. And then when the standards come out, you say, okay, what has changed? What is different? It's likely not going to be a lot. That just makes a lot of sense, in my opinion.
And Shay, you said something during our last session that absolutely resonated with me and I walked away with, in that you said there is nothing incompatible in 42001 as it relates to the AI Act and our understanding of how to implement it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think some people might argue, I mean, there's been arguments about the nature of the risk. I think that was the key, the thing that the crux of some of the debate was that 42001 and the risk standard for AI that it references, it does not think about risk in terms of external users and fundamental rights in the same way. I think that's mistaken. I think that's not the case, and there's enough flexibility there that if that it's a very natural, given the context of the organization is that we have fundamental rights that we have to protect from the people who interact with our system, it should be in there anyway if you've done it right from the beginning.
Absolutely. And one thing I do want to say before we get too far from it, at this point, I think we're fairly confident that we won't have conformity standards by the end of April. At this point, I'm not sure how common that knowledge is, but I think it's fairly common, which again leaves organizations in a position where it's better to act in a way that we know will be supportive than to simply wait until there's too much work to be done to bring oneself into conformance with expectations of external regulation. Now, because aside from what's happening in Europe with the AI Act and Sentinel, we've had some changes here domestically as well, here in the States. Earlier this week, Executive Order 14110, I think is the number, essentially the executive order around trustworthy AI, is also being rescinded, which I think opens some gaps here in the States. I don't know if you have an opinion about how those changes might affect what we're doing domestically, or any coaching on ways in which we could potentially implement 42001 to bring ourselves the same level of preparedness that we see with 42001 in Europe.
I don't know who wants. I mean, I'll go quickly. I mean, I think clearly there are gaps that are opening up, right? The federal government is probably going to be less worried about compliance, and so some of the regulators that were very vocal, like EEOC, FTC, those kind of regulators who are very vocal about risk of AI systems are going to be less probably resourced and less aggressive about that. That's my guess. Like, you don't want to bank on that because the law is the law, and so that's something that I would imagine is a significant change. However, I think that statewide regulations, or regulations state by state, they are proliferating. They're not slowing down. Yes. And so in the context of ISO 42001, the context of your organization is that you're operating in these states, that some of those are going to impact the way you manage and compliance for your AI systems. And so I don't think this slows anything down. I think, in fact, it increases the need for a systematic management system for how you're going to manage the risks associated and the opportunities associated with AI. Because if you're not organized, then there's not going to be some blanket federal preemption that you can count on here. It's going to be really state by state, very granular.
And Kim, I see you acknowledging.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Shay. I think that, we already know that the state law in Colorado specifically calls out 42001 certification as a way to show compliance with the regulation. likely in the absence of a lot of options for different AI certifications, you're going to see things like pointing to the NIST AI RMF, pointing to 42001, pointing to kind of generic AI governance and risk procedures in state laws, is my, personal opinion and based on what we've seen so far. And 42001 will, give your organization the foundation to be able to either, 100% comply with that, as in Colorado, or meet the various requirements in the state law because you're already doing the things that you need to be, that the various laws point out. Additionally, we're going to be seeing more regulations across the globe, outside of just the EU. And frankly, most companies these days are doing business across the world. And so you're going to have a system in place to comply with many different requirements from many different regions, from many different states, from many different countries, and do that in a way that impacts the functioning of your business in the least disruptive way possible. Management systems are, one of the best ways that I've personally found to be able to do this because of their flexibility and scalability.
And Kim, early on, as 42001 was really just an idea, and you were on the road promoting it through your role with ISO, you said something that just like Shay mentioned last week, something that struck me. You said something that stays with me to this day, and that is 42001 certification is really about offering assurance through an entire supply chain, start to finish. And so as a certification body, one of our points of education that we want to continue to reinforce in the market is that though there are lots of really solid standards to help organizations prepare themselves, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework being one, ISO 42001 offers more than compliance and conformance. It also offers the ability to generate assurance in the form of certification, independent third-party certification, which again, in my mind, is one of the things that helps 42001 stand out from the others. Though it can be supplemented by, it still, in my mind, should be the foundation for what organizations are doing as they're building out their responsible practices.
Yeah.
Here. Okay, guys, question number two that we left unanswered last week. Is the EU seen, last session, is the EU seen as a global standard setter around the world, or are jurisdictions ignoring what the EU has done with the AI Act and coming up with their own legal frameworks, perhaps based on different values, market levers, culture? I don't know if you have an opinion here.
So I'll just quickly offer one example that we've seen that's I don't know if I would say a stark contrast, but definitely a contrast that as opposed to the EU, which I think it's definitely a regulatory leader, not just with AI regulation, but tech regulation in general. GDPR, cybersecurity regulation, AI regulation. But for AI in particular, Japan provides a really unique difference. South Korea as well, where they have taken a much more kind of wait and see, fostering innovation type approach, because of the tech industry in Japan and again South Korea to a certain extent. It's a much more cautious approach than the EU has taken, that really wants to kind of wait and see so that, innovation in this age of AI isn't stifled. And so I think the government is, they're doing some really innovative things in the sense of they're very interested in solving conformity assessment problems for digital services, digital products. How do we certify in a digital world rather than a tangible product world, which is something that Europe is really struggling with because their conformity assessment ecosystem is very much based on a tangible product history, their entire legislative framework, and that's something that has set up kind of this struggle between, all right, there's all these regulations and they have some really good points and requirements, but when you go to assess and certify, everything is based on the approach to tangible products versus something that is digital and that's changing all the time, and how do you assess it? So Japan is really approaching it from kind of a new perspective of let's talk about how we do conformity assessment maybe before we start heavily regulating, which I think is a really good and unique perspective. I've been having lots of conversations with researchers and others in Japan about that. So, it's not to say one is necessarily better than the other. It's just a different approach.
And just to clarify, Kim, so you're saying, at least with what you're saying in Japan right now, they're verifying they can run a conformity assessment before they enact regulation to support it.
I mean, I don't know that I would say that specifically, and I don't want to speak on behalf of, Japanese government or assessment bodies.
What?
I'm just saying that I think their approach is much more cautious about enacting regulation that might stifle technological innovation. So they're kind of waiting and seeing like what the EU regulation looks like. At the same time, they are having lots of conversations about how do we do conformity assessment in a world that is becoming much more digital, that has different requirements from a testing perspective, from a certification perspective, than a tangible product only perspective. How those are necessarily related and the extent to which they're related, I'm not going to surmise on that, but I think that they're whether it is conscious or not, there's some relationship.
And Kim, regardless of what's happening with the regulation from a country perspective, I know you've done a ton of research into how to blend these worlds together and in a very effective way. So thank you. Thanks for all the effort you've put into solving this.
Yeah.
Shade, any opinion here? Again, I feel like I've shifted conversation away from you.
Oh, no. I'm just listening. I think so. I think the short answer is yes. There's likely going to be different regulations, right? And the approaches will be different. And so, if you look at the UK and Singapore, for instance, there's a big push on AI assurance, as a term, and for them and it's pro innovation in both cases, and that term is meant to encapsulate a lot of different kinds of tests and assessments and engagements and things like this to try to increase the safety, the credibility, the trustworthiness of AI systems, right? And other countries like Canada will try to mimic the EU AI Act in its structure. But I think at the end of the day, if you look at what the EU Act requires or what it's going to require of companies, there's not much missing, right? There's going to be some details about the way the way specific laws in specific countries are going to worry about how discrimination works or worry about how privacy works and that kind of thing. But the processes that have to get put into place aren't going to be that much different. You have to assess risk. You have to really think carefully about the technical controls you have in place, the organizational controls. They're going to look kind of similar. And they're not going to be really, really different. And so in my mind, focusing on the most stringent makes a lot of sense, and say, okay, how would we enact a compliance program or a management system that is going to get us coverage over the EU, knowing that that's going to have a lot of coverage internationally. And then it's sort of like whack-a-mole with some of the nuances between what some of these things might mean or what the details of the obligations are across. So in my mind, it doesn't change. There's no fundamental thing that I would, in terms of how I change my thinking, knowing that there might be slight differences across the countries. It's just we now have a very comprehensive, very onerous law in front of us, and that's the hurdle, and that's what you tackle first, and then you're going to get a huge amount of coverage internationally if you can do that right, making use of things like 42001 as a base.
And then, Shay, you bring up a very important perspective that I think gets left out of a lot of these conversations, and that's the perspective of the organization itself. And so as we talk about pressures on companies, particularly as it relates to either regulation or third-party compliance, we talk about regulatory pressure, of which an example would be the EU AI Act, but we also talk about market pressure. And one of the things that we are seeing more and more of late are large enterprises, particularly headquartered here in the US, pursuing 42001 certification. We have clean examples in Anthropic, Google Cloud, AWS. Is that a signal in your mind that more market pressure will be hitting smaller organizations, or do you think that's irrelevant?
Yeah, so it's definitely not irrelevant. There is significant market pressure, I think, now. Like, the more companies that come out and say we are 42001 certified, the more likely it is that other enterprises will want to get certified. And it's also more likely that they will expect that their vendors or the people that they work with are also certified. There is a network effect that's going to happen, that is happening, and I think it's going to be going to be a relief from some of what we're seeing right now. So just to speak from a personal perspective, all the time we have people come to us and say, this company, Enterprise X, whatever it may be, has asked us, is worried about these things, and they want some kind of assurance around, are we doing these sorts of things? They don't know for sure what exactly that will look like, and nor do we, frankly. It's like, okay, we can do assurance over this, and this, but what is the enterprise really worried about? And there's confusion along the whole chain. They know there's risks, they know that they need to mitigate those risks, and then the vendors need to know that they have to do something to satisfy the enterprise clients. And then the enterprises, of course, are amongst themselves are going to be worried about. They want to make sure that they're look good, right? And so, yeah. I think that this is going to relieve a little bit of that, because now it's like, okay, here's a clear standard. It's going to eventually become table stakes. There aren't really any like SOC 2 versions, like with 27001. There's no SOC 2 version that's an alternative. It's just going to become table stakes for, I have an AI system, I need to be 42001 certified, and then there'll always be other extra things that people have to check because of the circumstances of the context of the AI system. But I think the pressure is real, and it's happening pretty fast, actually.
And just to say this to our listeners, we recognize, particularly when you're dealing with market pressure, but regardless of what happens in the news, these issues become real when they start showing up in agreements. I mean, that really just is what it is. I think the take home is that more and more you will see these requirements as it relates to assurance of responsible AI development and use showing up in your agreements. As an example, and Kim, I know that you can't talk a lot about Microsoft's SSPA, but what we do know from public consumption, public knowledge, is that the SSPA program for 2025 and moving forward actually calls out ISO 42001 as an alternative certification path to submit to Microsoft to maintain good standing in the program.
Yeah, and I mean, you can access the documentation online. It's publicly available, and that's one of the ways that suppliers who are providing certain AI services to us can show that they are compliant with our requirements, is to have a 42001 certification. There's a number of requirements. If you don't do that, then there's other ways to show that you're compliant, which involves, I think, being subjected to audits or sending in certain documentation. It's been years since I've interacted with that program, but there's various other ways. But providing a certification is a lot easier than saying, like, okay, Microsoft, send someone of your choosing out to our organization and let them go through all of our stuff, at our expense. And yeah, it's much easier to provide that certification. And it's very common from a cybersecurity perspective to do that with 27001. It's common to do it from a privacy perspective with 27701. So, companies are going to, they're familiar, they're comfortable with those two. I expect that from a supply chain perspective, it's going to become this trio of stuff that is security, privacy, AI, kind of bundled into agreements for suppliers and providers.
Integrated and holistic management, Kim, I totally agree. Governance and management, totally agree. And guys, our last question from last session, I was going to say last week again, our last unanswered question from last session, I think really opens up the door for taking a different direction in our dialogue. That said, the last question was, before initiating 42001 certification efforts, what kind of readiness assessments or gap analyses should an organization conduct to identify existing strengths and weaknesses? Which I think is an incredible question. And guys, if you don't mind, I might lead in answering this one, and then feel free to pick apart or add to what I say. As a CB, for us, it is imperative that organizations are ready for us to do our external assessment. But we have very strict impartiality and objectivity requirements that we have to maintain. So there's not a lot of coaching. In fact, no coaching and no guidance can be delivered by our teams as we're doing our third-party assessment, which means orgs need to be prepared. And in my mind, the best path forward for organizations, as they are considering taking on building their own AI management system, their aims, is to first of all start with the standard. Everyone listening, you must own a copy of 42001. In addition, you'll see a number of normative references called out in 42001 that will be incredibly supportive of your success, should you choose to go ahead and purchase and download those as well. But with the standard in hand, with a clear understanding of what's being asked of you, what's being expected of you. Next, Kim, as you've continued to ring the bell, I think scoping and defining context become the next most important things. So get the standard, know what you're up against, know what the expectations are. It doesn't need to be confrontational. Understand your scoping, understand your context, and then from there, actually start thinking about how you stack up. So whether it's a formal gap assessment, an informal gap assessment, I think organizations need to be able to objectively look at themselves, warts and all, and understand what gaps they legitimately need to fill before they pursue earning their certification. Now, guys, that was a lot of words, but I'm totally open to any feedback you have for me on kind of my proposed path forwards.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of that is exactly right and relevant. I think that if this is it, a lot of it depends on a lot of factors. If this is your first management system, you definitely need to spend some time learning what a management system is, what it does, how to implement it correctly. A lot of organizations just kind of check the boxes, and sure, you can pass an audit by doing that, but it's not going to give you a lot of value. I think really understanding the point of a management system, constructing it in a thoughtful way, so that you're actually like going back to the whole clause on the context of the organization, thinking critically about, I'm subject to the EU AI Act. How do I incorporate the requirements of the AI Act into my system level controls? How do I enhance the system level controls in annexes A and B of 42001 with the more specific requirements of the AI Act? That's something that you should be doing. Not everyone is doing that, but they should be as part of actually implementing the management system. So really spending the time to, invest in the management system aspect, not just the system level controls. If you've already got a management system like 27001 or 27701 or 9001 implemented, look at the documentation that you have for those and determine, are you going to enhance that documentation with new requirements from 42001? Are you going to create brand new documentation? Are you going to do an integrated management system or separate management systems? I think that's an important question. And then as far as the system level controls go from annexes A and B, so actually what your AI system is doing, after you scope and figure out what components are in scope, what actual systems are in scope, what machine learning models are in scope, what algorithms are in scope, what data is in scope, you need to actually do a gap assessment between the controls that your organization has in place and those controls that are in those annexes. And that might be, there's a huge gap because we don't have a control, and great, put a control in place. But gap assessments are incredibly important to prepare yourself.
Yeah, totally agree. I think a gap assessment, when you're ready for a gap assessment, is, and there's there's different levels of organizations, different sizes of organizations. I think you really, Patrick, like you said it, you need to get the standard, and then you need to go through those initial exercises, clause 4. Like you have to figure out, and even if you don't fully figure out the scope, like the context, you got to get right, and you got to get the leadership kind of buy-in there. But just understand sort of what it is you're dealing with. That's the first thing. And the things that I've seen have been struggling points is like people want to go further, right? And they have some things in place, but not sure what actually applies. And I think there's a different level of documentation that people will conflate or don't understand there, and levels of doing, right? So a common thing I'll see, right, that first people will start is like they're writing down what they ought to do. So they look at the standard and it's like, okay, they're basically writing the document to their future selves saying, we do this and we do that, right? But the thises and that's are not fully specified, right? But that's actually a pretty good exercise to start with, right? And so it's like, maybe get that documentation, like the letter to your future self or a future auditor, that's like, here's what we have done to satisfy the requirement. Like, so after you got the context done. And then the next step, of course, obviously, is the things that would get linked to that. Like, what is the actual policy around doing a risk assessment and when and why, right? And that's the next level. And I think people need to dive into that, because I see people getting paralyzed at that first level. And then the next one, because they know people are already doing some processes and it's like, do I want to rewrite the wheel or whatever? But I think there is, you got to get over that paralysis, because once you start that second level of documentation, that's where it's actually could be fun. You can see opportunities for improving your processes. You can see opportunities for making your life easier and being compliant, increasing trustworthiness, all of that stuff. That next level is where the fun stuff is. And so if that level is not done that second level is not done, don't do a gap analysis. You're not ready for gap analysis yet. You got to get that level done. Furthermore, then there's the fact that people actually have to follow those policies. So now I've said we need to have risk assessments done. Here's our criteria and all that stuff. Has that ever been executed? Probably not. So if you're in that situation where it hasn't been executed, then you have to start getting people to actually do it. And you're going to find problems and all that stuff. Now, once you've got to that level where it's like I have sort of general policies and maybe they're not perfect, and then I've had a few months of people trying it out. We've been documenting that process really well. That's the perfect spot where it's like, okay, now I can have a gap analysis. I've done the best I could, and now let's bring somebody else in who's going to look at that with the understanding that you haven't implemented fully everything, but they're going to be able to point out the low-hanging fruit and all the details, of course, about what's missing. It'll give you clarity. But if you haven't done that first level of documentation, that second level of documentation, and had some people try to execute on those policies and procedures, then you're not going to get the full value from a gap assessment, because a company like mine will tell you that you ought to do this, but then that's still going to feel very far from reality for you. And it has to be, when we say something, you have to know, okay, I'm going to have Sarah or John do this differently, and we're going to document it differently that way. Otherwise, because you don't want to be figuring out that Sarah and John are supposed to be doing that in the first place, because that's not the value you get from a gap analysis. Anyway, I just wanted to paint a picture of sort of like, for people who are struggling to figure this out, like where it is that you would get to before you kind of call in somebody from the outside to take a look at what you're doing.
And can I just add?
Please.
So I'm just going to respond because I see there's a question in the chat about risk assessment versus gap assessment. So risk assessment in all management system standards is a requirement in the management system clauses. So that is something that you have to do as part of your management system processes as you're implementing the management system. It's part of clause 6. And you also, as part of 42001, have to do something called the AI system impact assessment. So yes, risk assessment, gap assessment is not the same thing. You do not have to do a gap assessment. Gap assessment is more of a preparation activity, whereas a risk assessment and risk management procedures, as well as the system impact assessment, are requirements that are part of your management system. You get audited on those. You have to have procedures in place. You have to complete the risk assessment for your organization. There actually is a AI-specific standard on guidance for doing organizational risk assessments for AI. I think it's 23894. Am I remembering that? Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have so many numbers floating in my head at all times. So yeah, just to clarify that, since I saw it come up in the chat, that those are risk assessments are very important. We don't want to forget about those. Absolutely, you have to do them.
And so we don't get too far away from this, Kim. I want to dovetail on that really quickly and say, yes, the risk and impact assessments are different. And what is absolutely critical is that those are done in context of your organization and your AI lifecycle. And for what it's worth, some prospects that I've spoken with intend to use their enterprise risk management program or their enterprise risk assessments to fulfill those requirements. And it can be very difficult to hear that that's not appropriate. That is not the intent of the risk management process and AI impact assessment processes as laid out in 42001.
So the outputs of your AI risk management process should definitely go up to your enterprise risk management, but it should not be, one should not substitute for the other. And your AI system impact assessment the outputs of that should feed up to your AI organizational risk assessment. So a system impact assessment is something that is specific to the system and is specifically about the rights of individuals, of society, and specific to an AI system. The outputs of that should definitely be considered in your organizational risk assessment. But again, not the same thing as enterprise risk. Similar concepts, all different.
And then I see Stephen. Stephen, first of all, thank you for the questions. But Kim, really quickly, before we step away, Stephen also mentions the NIST AI RMF. And so just to be plain, as we think about 42001's requirement for AI risk assessment processes, both planned and executed, 42001 doesn't say you have to use 23894. NIST AI risk management framework would be appropriate as well, depending on the context of the organization, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, the risk management framework is... yes, short story. Yes, you can definitely use that. There is a published mapping between 23894 and the risk management framework on NIST's crosswalk page. It is a little bit apples to oranges because the NIST risk management framework has a little bit more what looks like controls, risk mitigation measures, whereas 23894 is based on ISO 31000. And so it's a little bit more conceptual, organizational. The NIST AI RMF is a bit more system level risk. So yes, but understand the differences between them.
And then Kim, not to cast a spotlight on you, but I think you actually helped produce that cross mapping between the AIRMF and the...
So there's a mapping between 23894 and the AIRMF and one between 42001 and the AIRMF. And I think there's one, or we're working on one between 42005 and the AIRMF. I'm not sure if that one's published yet or if ANSI is still working on it.
Okay, thank you. Guys, really quickly, it kind of feels like we've transitioned a little bit to responding to some of the questions. Maybe with our few minutes left, I think we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe I pick a few questions just to throw out at you. Totally open to your responses. A question from Frank: as AI becomes more widely used across industries, how much should we expect explicit AI? And it looks like there's a little bit more here. AI controls to become embedded within existing frameworks like SOX, HIPAA, HITRUST. Just really quickly, Frank, I will say HITRUST currently has, what to my knowledge is the only AI security certification on the market. So HITRUST has already embraced this and is moving forward. If you are a HITRUST customer, reach out to us. We can help you get more information on this and help you walk through that process. Kim, Shay, I don't know how much opinion you have on whether or not AI explicit controls work their way into AI CPA standards, into other standards body standards. Is that something that you've been tracking with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's coming for sure. It's just a matter of time. I think everybody recognizes for all of these, like, so IT testing, for like SOC 2 cybersecurity stuff, you're peeling back these systems and you're looking at controls, you're looking at very specific things, you might be doing some testing. All of that is going to be impacted by AI in one way or the other, because some of these systems will be based on AI or have AI components. And so I think that there will be little requirements that sneak in. I think one of the bigger issues is competency of the practitioners and making sure that they are aware of the fact or aware of how AI influences their job and the risks associated with those kind of assessments. I think that's something we're going to see unfolding over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think that a big part of it is one of the key pieces that continues to be developed is these testing mechanisms for AI. How do you develop tests for the outputs of AI systems? So like if you're doing a SOX audit and an AI system was used to, analyze financial data, how do you determine, essentially the metrology behind the outputs of AI systems? And that's very much an ongoing discussion. And so I think that we're a little bit flying the plane as we're building it right now. With AI is definitely being used. We don't quite have testing mechanisms for auditors to use in all situations right now. So I expect, as Shay said, we will definitely see that as the validation and measurement mechanisms become more mature.
And then Shay, I think you're actually actively working to address this issue through both Babel and the International Association of Algorithmic Auditors. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big priority for us to address the issues of competency, and that's one, and also the issues of the controls themselves. Like, what is a substantive, because when you get down to system level controls or system level testing, what is a substantive test that will inform my understanding of the risk of the system? And yes, that's a active research, and we don't know what we're doing. Like, some people know more about what they're doing than others, but the fact is the whole field is evolving. And so we have to be kind of constantly evolving our field of assessment, our field of audit and assurance, to keep up with the fact that the AI field is changing, and that ecosystem is very, very dynamic. And so it's front and center, top of mind for both Babel, International Association of Algorithmic Auditors, but I think all professional organizations that touch AI have to deal with this.
And then Shay, again, to cast a light on Babel, right now Babel is working to actually educate the market to help bridge that gap, that deficiency that we currently see for algorithmic auditors. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of by accident, but I mean, the fact is we have to audit systems. We provide assurance about the testing that other people do for their systems, the guardrails they have for their systems. And these are assurance engagements, which the purpose is to increase the credibility of the information the company is giving, right, to whatever stakeholder. And so there's just it's not structured like 42001, where it's very structured what those processes and how to audit them. And so the capabilities that we expect of auditors in that situation, given that there is risk of material misstatement, which relies on sort of very technical understanding of the way the systems work, and sort of this, what a substantive risk assessment actually means, one that's actually considered all of the sources of risk, for instance. That takes a really special set of capabilities. And because that didn't really exist, you don't get a degree in this. We've kind of had to take our practice and distill it down into education. And so we've opened it up. It was initially just for our auditors, but now we're offering it to others, but that is out of necessity. Is just because the field is moving so fast. We can't wait for universities to figure it out, and we can't wait for very large deliberative bodies to move fast enough to provide that education. So it's really out of necessity.
And the field and the community are grateful for the work that you're doing. I can absolutely attest to that. Guys, I think we have time for one more question. I see it from Kareem. We can't get off the call without asking this. How do you see the upcoming months? How do you feel about AI safety assessment and evaluation in the coming months? Will we see an uptick? Will we see more clarity? What are your thoughts on AI safety assessment and evaluations?
I don't know, Kim, if you want to go first.
If you have an answer, I guess I'm not sure what context we're talking about AI safety assessments in.
Yeah, I mean, I'll guess what, but I think that we're probably going to see an uptick in the use of the term AI safety, and I mean that because part of the change in political administration, some of the priorities have shifted. And so I think AI safety is a term which is much more agnostic to political party or agenda, right? And because everybody can kind of agree on safety is an important thing. And so I think as a concept, probably AI safety as a practice is going to be much more of a thing, a term that gets used. Whether it's like an AI safety assessment continues. I mean, some of the work done there was at the US AI Safety Institute. We'll see whether that, with the executive order, whether that continues as a entity and is going to continue to do work in this area. I think there's some uncertainty there. But I think globally, it is going to be those kind of assessments. The field is going to continue to grow because it's just something that everybody can agree on. These systems interact with us and our fundamental rights, including the right to bodily safety, economic safety, all of that stuff. And so we're going to have to do these assessments and get good at understanding how to really do it well.
Yeah, and yes, and I was talking to someone yesterday about the in the US, and I was talking to someone in Japan, and I was like, well, as of yesterday, they don't exist anymore in the US. So, but in the UK and I think Japan have safety institutes that they're spinning up. My hope is that not necessarily for the assessments themselves, but for the safety institutes, that the work that they're doing will, tied back to our last question, help additionally push for this need that we have for measurements, for metrology, for ways to both accurately, but in a logical and risk-based, reasonable way, measure outputs and results of AI systems. And so I'm hoping that the work that these safety institutes are doing will help come up with, solutions for that, create more dialogue around that.
And with 48 seconds left, Kim, Shay, thank you both so much. Thanks for making time again to come on and speak with our audience. To our listeners, Shay Brown at Babel AI, Kim Lucy at Microsoft, please take the words and the guidance that they have given us today and do something with them. Though you might not feel now is the time to begin the process of building your AI management system, I have to say that it is. If you wait, you will be waiting in vain. So start, even if it's small steps, take those small steps that we outlined in our last session and begin doing something. You will be very glad that you did. In the interim, should you need assistance with education, should you need assistance with readiness, Shay, I think Babel excels in those functions. I think our listeners could reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to our listeners, should you have any questions, please reach out to us. Reach out to us at A-LIGN. We're happy to answer the questions that we can and connect you with folks that can answer them should we not be able to. So thank you all for making space today. We look forward to seeing you again next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.